This is going to be a long episode. I am going to be talking about the Endgame, particularly the Endgame divides into three parts, the final part of the Endgame, and presenting a whole bunch of examples. And I think this is a really useful analytical trick to understand. Very naturally, people begin to analyse games by asking, what do I do on the first move? And then what do I do on the second move? But often it's more useful to jump right the way to the end of the game and say, what does a winning position look like? What does a losing position look like? And if I know that, then I can work backwards and ask, how do I get to the winning positions rather than the losing positions? It also is what you need in order to understand conceding a game. This clip is from the Netflix show Queen's Gambit.
You resign now.
Resign?
That's right, child. When you lose the queen that way, you resign. It's not a rule. It's sportsmanship.
Everything about this clip is wrong. Literally everything it says about how and why you concede in a board game is just a complete misunderstanding. And I know why they did it this way. They needed a visual signifier within their kind of movie film language to indicate that Beth wins a game. So they established that within this scene, and they also established the beginning of a character arc for the main character. But conceding is not fundamentally about good sportsmanship. Conceding is about avoiding something that is tedious for both players. You concede because you know the opponent is going to win. The opponent knows they're going to win. Both of you have seen this position enough times before that it just doesn't hold any interest for either of you, and so you don't want to waste your time playing through it. There is an element of etiquette in it. When you concede, you are acknowledging that your opponent is not going to make an error. You're saying, you are good enough that you can win from this position. There is no need for you to prove it to me. In Hex Encounter Wargames, by the way, this is an excellent reason not to complain about your dice rolls. Because when you come to concede, you want to be saying, I concede that you have outplayed me, and that from here you are not going to make an error. You don't want to be saying, God, my dice rolls suck, and I've only lost because of my bad luck. Apart from anything else, because that implies that if you rolled a 6-1 from here on in, you would win, and that of course raises the question of why you're conceding, since the position isn't in fact lost. So let's look at an actual position and ask, is this lost? This is a position in June 1942. France has not fallen yet. Is it a lost position? And should you concede? Well, I think the answer is fairly simple. Can you tell me, if this is a lost position, when Germany will collapse? Because if you don't know when Germany will collapse, given this sort of position, you don't really understand the position, which means you have something to learn by playing it out to the bitter end. What about this position? This is December 1942. France has collapsed. However, the UK has got troops ashore in northern Italy, and the Russians are in Poland. Is it now lost, or can the Germans force the British back off their beachheads and then turn the situation around on the Eastern Front? If they can't, how long will it take for the British and Soviets to finish this? Again, if you have not played this through, you cannot understand the answers to those questions. Therefore, you need to play it through. What about this one? It's February 1941 in this case. The Germans have failed to collapse Russia In an East Front game, the Russian national will has now jumped up as a result of appeasement ending. Is this a lost position? If it is a lost position, how long will it take for the French and the Soviets to defeat the Germans? I'll let you in on a secret. Previous two were, but this one is not a lost position. It is entirely possible for the Germans to defeat the French in this situation while still holding the Russians at bay, and then turn the tide once more on the Soviet front. And there's our basic rule of thumb. No concessions unless you have played the scenario out. And in fact, that's pretty much what should be happening in that scene from The Queen's Gambit. Beth has never dropped her queen through a blunder early in the game, so she needs to play out the game to understand why losing one queen is not the same as losing one pawn, and it is ultimately a lost position. But she needs to understand that, and she can only understand that by actually playing the game out. Today, we're going to talk about the endgame. Broadly speaking, a game of unconditional surrender can be divided into three phases: the opening, the mid-game, and the endgame. And these are related to the disposition of forces between the different factions. At the beginning of the game, the Germans have rough parity with both the Soviet and the Western forces. However, very quickly in the early part of the game, the German player receives a lot of additional units. Between 39 and early 41, you get a shift in the opening where available German forces vastly exceed those of either the Soviet or the Western powers, which essentially makes the opening attack the Germans launch almost unstoppable, usually, of course, directed against the French. However, by the mid-game, that has changed. The Soviet and Western forces match or slightly overpower the total German forces, and both the Western and Soviet forces are in play. The mid-game kicks in at the point where Allied players have parity with the German forces. And what happens through 42 and 43 in a historical game is that gradually the Soviet forces increase in quality and the Western forces increase in both quality and quantity, to a point where the German army is not capable of matching both groups simultaneously. And this gradually moves us into the endgame. So the endgame is in three parts, and it begins with the final summer offensive. So this is the final full year that is actually played out, and the summer offensive from June to September. And this matches 21 German field units against 8 Allied armoured and 17 Soviet motorised. Both the Soviets and the Allies have other forces as well, but the ones that really count are those troops. And what you can tell immediately is that's a significant numerical advantage for the Allied players. And the Germans must fight on two fronts, defending against an invasion in Western Europe and against an advancing Soviet army on the Eastern Front. That broadly comes to an end when poor weather kicks in October-November at the end of the summer offensive. It is possible to make some ground during the winter phase, especially with the Soviets. You should absolutely be trying to do so. You should be trying to keep the Germans off balance. There's probably a whole video to be done on how to carry out poor weather offensives. This is a good example of what you do. You kind of launch your attacks in waves. So here, 3 units attacked Vienna and they forced a retreat. But instead of any of them advancing in, a fresh unit was shoved into Vienna, and that unit then launched an attack as a successive wave. In this particular case, it's threatening to cut off the supply for the German 7th Infantry, basically forcing the German player to react, forcing them to spend production points. interfering with what this part of the Endgame, which is all about, which is essentially the German army rebuilding from its losses in the final summer offensive so that it's at full strength to meet the final attack. And then you get to the third part of the game. This is the position in the historical 1945 scenario. A little bit of editorializing. I don't like the 1945 historical scenario. It's got too many special rules. It deprives the Western player of units that any Western player would normally have in this situation. It just kind of blanks the Italian front, which is weird. It should just be a historical position. I feel quite strongly about this with all the scenarios. They should just be positions that are played out under the normal rules of the main event. They should not be special rules operating in them. But this is what it looks like in that situation. And the final part of the endgame is played out from the point when fair weather breaks. Essentially, the question that you are asking yourself at this stage is, once fair weather breaks, can the Germans hold on until July to scrape a win? So let's talk about the weather. The final offensive occurs almost exclusively in the mild zone. Very occasionally there are a few units in the cold weather or the warm zone, but the vast majority of the fighting takes place in the mild zone. So everything hinges on the dice rolls for that. There's never any fair weather in January or February. There's always fair weather in July. In between, there are 4 months where there might be fair weather. March, April are a dependent probability. That's one of the things that's very curious about the weather table. It's not completely independent probabilities. If you get fair weather in March, you won't get it in April, vice versa. And the result of that is that there are 1 to 4 fair weather turns in total. The extreme situations occur about 1 game in 5. So 1 game in 10, roughly, you will have only July as fair weather. About 1 game in 10, you will have 4 turns of fair weather, which will either come as a solid block as the last 4 turns of the game, or as a fair weather march, followed by 3 solid turns of fair weather in May to July. 1 turn is hugely beneficial to the German army. It gives them much longer to rebuild, effectively in the bad weather phase, and they have to sustain much less of an Allied attack. 4 turns is great for the Allies. It reduces the amount of time the Germans have to rebuild, and it allows the Allies to conduct a lot more fair weather attacks, especially for the Western Allies with their air superiority. More common is 2 turns. There's quite a wide variation in how 2 turns will happen. The most common 2-turn situation is that June and July are 2 consecutive turns of fair weather. It is correspondingly worse for the Allies the larger the gap between these 2 turns. A March fair weather turn, followed by 3 poor weather turns, followed by a fair weather turn. That's not great for the Allies because it effectively gives you 1 fair weather turn of attack, then allows the Germans 3 months of rebuilding, and then another fair weather turn. 2 turns is about equally likely with 3 turns. Again, 3 turns can be distributed in different ways, and generally speaking, consecutive turns are better. The Allies, broken up is better for the Axis. The endgame is fundamentally about national will. Germany usually has 20 cities, 21 cities at the end of the game, and it can be defeated if all of them are conquered. However, in practice, that is usually unnecessary. Those cities add up to a total of 44 national will, and technically to conquer Germany, all you need to do is conquer 1 city and reduce the national will of the Germans to 0. Given that in most cases a city will fall with a unit actually in it, with a field unit in it. So you will gain the 2 points for the city. You'll also gain a point for destroying the unit. That's something like 60 to 70 points of national will you're going to take by taking all the cities. So unless the Germans have a truly spectacular amount of national will at the end of the game, they're going to collapse long before all of the cities are captured. The reason that this might vary a little bit is to do with the Polish corridor. There are 2 cities in the Polish corridor, Danzig and Posen, and they are only German if Germany conquers Poland at the beginning of the game. If Poland is an ally, then those cities are not German, and therefore there's no national will to be lost by them being overrun. So when I began to think about taking a look at the endgame, because I kind of realised that once you'd done a little bit of basic tactics and you began to want to think about the way the game fitted together at a strategic level, the first place you would want to go is the endgame. I started to collect data on actual endgames. So again, on the third part of the endgame, so this is the moment when fair weather breaks. And some of this data comes from historical scenarios, 43 to 5, 44 to 5, 45, and some of it comes from main event games. Obviously, the positions are going to be much more variable in a main event game than they are in a historical scenario. But the basic fundamental principles will apply to both. We'll take a look at 4 historical scenarios now. These are going to be the positions when fair weather broke, and in the vast majority of these, the Germans lose. The Germans are conquered at some point. Let's start with this one. This one's a little bit odd. It comes from a 41 to 45 game, and here the Allies conducted a Denmark landing rather than a France landing in 44. So you can see they have that outpost in northwest Germany. That's where their beachhead is. The Soviets are in a good position. They've got to Vienna and Posen, and the Germans have 17 points of national will. This position is lost. Disastrously lost. It's May 1945 when the first fair weather turn breaks. The Germans immediately launch some small-scale counterattacks, the result of which is that they push their national will back up to 21. The Allies then counterattack, and at the end of the turn, the Germans have 1 point of national will. They launch some counterattacks again on the next turn in June, pushing it back up to 9, and then they collapse before the Western faction's turn is over. This is a very lost position. This is from a 1945 game, so you'll see nothing on the Italian front. The German position against the Soviets is substantially better. They're holding them, Poland and Hungary. It's a more traditional position for the Allies in the West. They've just begun to cross the border into Germany, and the Germans have 26 points of national will. The Germans have also succeeded in rebuilding their army and getting 8 sorties back onto the Luftwaffe. The German forces collapse in less than 2 months. This is nowhere near a good enough position for the German forces to have any realistic chance of surviving. In this game, we only have 25 national will, so we were a point down on the last game. But it's a better position in the West. You can see that the Allies are still very firmly in France. And fair weather breaks in May. The Germans do not last long here. They don't get through a full 2 months of fair weather before they collapse. We move to another position, and this is an even better position in the West. You can see that while the Allies are ashore around the historical beachheads, they are still basically at the beachheads in France. They've successfully pushed through to the northern plain in Italy, but the Germans are still holding the far side of the Alps. and have a little bit of ground to give in Hungary. I actually have a recording of what happens in this game. Let's talk about some of the details. This is zooming in on the situation on the Eastern Front. There's a concentration of armour here, so at the beginning of fair weather, it's always the Germans who get to go first when the fair weather happens. There's a brief counter-attack here which kills a few Soviet units, frees up some of the panzers to get back to better defensive positions. And this is what the situation looks like in July 45. You can see the Germans have managed to hold in the Alps. They've lost Hungary. They've got units surrounded, and the Soviets are pushing across the North German plains. In the west, the Allied beachheads have pushed through France and reached the German border. Now you can also see, I've marked it, the kind of arrangement of the defence that I'm making. So there is an outer layer of defence, and then behind it, about 2 hexes back, there is a secondary line, often consisting of garrisons or units that have been recently rebuilt at half strength. On the Western Front, I also have a little sacrificial line in the front of garrison units. Now, very important when you're doing that, you need to block the garrison units' retreats so that if they're blown up, the no enemy zone of control marker can't allow a breakthrough. And Germany held this position. Here's how they did it. Okay, so we've seen Germany hold. Let's look at some more games where the Axis player wins. We're going to start with one that's an outrageously good position. This is the position in April 1945 when fair weather breaks for the first time, you can see that the Soviet forces are still being held in Romania rather than on the Romanian-Hungarian border in eastern Poland, that the Allies have been stopped in southern Italy, and that there has not been a successful landing in France. Oh, and the Germans have 65 points of national will. This is a staggeringly good position. Now, as it happens here, the Allied player did in fact get an April and May fair weather. The first thing that happened is the fully rebuilt Luftwaffe neutralised the Soviet Air Force. Despite that, the Germans lost 10 units, including 3 field units, in the first turn in April. In May, they managed to halt the Soviet advance, launching a large-scale counterattack, which took 6 Soviet units out and retook Königsberg, which had been lost in the previous month. The Allies did launch a rather clever landing at Trieste, but they only barely made it ashore in France. And at this point, my opponent actually resigned the game. So I never got to find out how much more damage the Soviets would be able to do. But you notice that essentially they've managed to fight their way across most of Poland and Hungary in the 2 months that were played out. It's worth noting here there's something interesting about Italy. By far the best way to slow the Allies down through the 6 or 7 hectares of narrow ground in Italy is the use of a panzer army. Even with air support, the Allies only have about 1 in 6 chance of forcing a retreat result, which they get 3 attacks with the lead unit, 1 or 2 attacks with each following unit. They're only going to force the panzer back 1 or 2 hexes each turn. So if you are still holding the Allies at this point in Italy, then the Italian front is effectively irrelevant for the endgame. You're going to get at most 4 feather weather turns. That's only just enough against a panzer to force the unit all the way back up to the North Italian plain. Note that, by the way, this only applies to a panzer. Replace that panzer with a standard German infantry and it won't last 1 turn. We're going to look at another game that also has a very strong position for the German players. One of the reasons that an Allied landing in Greece in 1943-1944 is a bad idea is not that Athens and Greece are a bad place to land. It's that eventually you end up at Belgrade. And when you do, because Belgrade is a junction, the Western and Soviet factions begin to interfere with each other's supplies. For all purposes, Western and Soviet forces are treated as enemy forces to each other. This is an example of that sort of game. The Allies have been halted in Italy, so they landed in Greece as a way of getting round. When they get to Belgrade, they're going to get in the way of each other's supply lines. It's actually going to cause Western and Soviet troops to fall into supply traps that are essentially going to halt that front. The Allies here are ashore in France, but only just at 2 widely dispersed beachheads, one of which is going to fail. There's only 2 turns of fair weather here because the fair weather breaks in June 1945, and the Germans have a quite respectable but less outrageous 41 points of national will. This is pretty much a 1 position for the Germans. There's one additional thing that's going on here again. The Germans have a complete rebuild of the Luftwaffe, and what they do is they use it to immediately attack the Soviet Air Force on the ground, wiping out Soviet air support. Why is that important? Here's what the attack of a Russian tank army looks like against a German infantry if it has air support. Now you'll notice this is a pretty good chance of a retreat. It's a pretty good chance of just getting a step loss. The Soviets have 6 tank armies. Each of them can potentially launch 3 attacks into rough terrain. An additional motorised unit can be effectively upgraded to a tank army by spending tank counters on it, and the Soviets can find 21 air sorties to boost that up. So that's 21 attacks that look like this, each of them with a 7 in 36 chance of a DD result. So you're expecting 4-step losses and a dozen or more retreats. That's going to make a mess of any German line. But if you're looking at a Russian infantry, even attacking in the open without air support, that's nowhere near as good. There's a big chance of just getting an attacker stopped result. There's less than a 1 in 6 chance of getting a DR. You've got no possibility of a DD result. Robbing the Soviets of their air support massively reduces the effectiveness of the Soviet offensive. And that's the fundamental thing that went wrong here. The Soviet Air Force was neutralised before the offensive began, and that means the Soviet forces simply bounced on a relatively strong German line. Yes, Soviet air resources are eventually exhausted in any lengthy offensive anyway, but usually by the time that's happened, the Germans are off balance and the Soviets are able to compensate for their lack of air forces by achieving isolate results. Another game, this time somewhere in between those two previous positions. So we're still looking at a complete rebuild of the Luftwaffe. The Allies are definitely ashore, but they've been contained at the beachheads through to the beginning of fair weather, which in this case is in May. The Soviet position is held in Poland and Hungary, and the Germans just held on to Königsberg. This is a really bad error to make. Just be aware of this. You can see that the Soviet air is not completely recovered, and it has been grouped tightly enough that it can be affected by a surprise attack counter. That means essentially being able to wipe it out with the German Air Force relatively easy, and having German air support available for a counter-attack. Again, you're probably wiping out that salient, so 4 to 6 Soviet units are going to be destroyed by the counter-attack. My opponent actually resigned immediately after this, so didn't get to play it out. However, I had used the save game function. Okay, so let me show you how this particular feature works. I've set up here a solo game. It's in training mode. It's got Lunenol's test undo system in effect. And I'm going to go to the game now. Take a few moments to load. It's going to look exactly like the start of a regular full game, but I'm going to come down and go to the menu button here, and here at the menu button you get these options to save the game or to load the game. So what I've done previously is I've taken a game that's in the end game and I've saved it, and now I am going to load that game. And you can see, in fact, I've got 3 games saved here, and I'm fairly sure it's this one that I want to load. And everything's reworking there. And you can see this is April 1944, and I've set this up as a fair weather turn. I actually did that. What I did was I saved the game in the previous turn, then I loaded the game here, then I kept making the moves to finish the turn, and then using the undo function to go back a step, and then redoing it until I got fair weather. And so this allows me now to play out this game with fair weather in the zones to see whether or not it's winnable for the Allies, given that the Germans have 44 national will, or not. And because I used the save game function, I was able to reload the game and use Lunenol's new undo system to essentially play out a version where I simply undid the weather rolls until I rolled fair weather in every turn. to see what the resulting situation was. The undo system is unfortunately still quite glitchy in places, but if what you're doing is essentially analysing a saved game, and I can strongly recommend analysing saved games as a really useful way of improving, then actually it works fine for just resetting weather rolls to give you a sense of what's going on. And this is an end position in July 1944. And you can see that despite having had their air force neutralised, the Soviets have still broken through. Despite having been held on the beachheads in 1944, the Allies are still right the way through France. They're breaking into the western border of Germany. And in this particular case, I think I ran it a couple of times, and this was the worst position that the Germans got. The Germans here have 9 points of national will left. They wouldn't survive another turn, but they have survived until July. It's still a 1 German position. They've lost about half of that from cities and about half of that from units. It's worth saying it wasn't lost evenly. The Germans were still in the mid-30s for national will at the end of May. The vast majority of it was lost in June and July as the casualties began to rack up, and that began to thin the German line and make it increasingly difficult for them to hold the position. You can see here that they're actually holding quite a few of these positions with units that are on half strength. Using the saved games, I'm now going to show you a comparison which will reinforce that little bit I explained about the odds with the Soviet Air Force. What I'm going to do is I reloaded it twice, so I had 2 games running simultaneously. In one of those, I committed the German Air Force to attack the Soviet Air Force, to effectively ground the Soviet Air Force and launch a counterattack on the Eastern Front. In the other, I launched the Luftwaffe against the beachheads to knock out the Allied supply, which meant, of course, that the Soviets had free rein on the Eastern Front. And here you can see the differences in those games playing out with the first round of Soviet attacks in April. And as you'll see as it plays through, it's not actually that big a difference. It's quite subtle. But that subtle difference begins to tell. An extra unit or 2 lost, an extra hex or 2 gained. And so by this point, at the end of May, there's about 12 points of national will difference between these 2 positions. But you can also see that the German position is beginning to crumble where the Soviets have been able to deploy air power. This is the start of July in both games. You can see that it doesn't really matter whether or not the Soviets have air. They are going to break through. Ultimately, the Soviet forces just are too strong for the German forces on the Eastern Front. Of course, that isn't the important thing. The important thing is not whether or not the Germans can hold in the long term. It's whether or not in the short term they can slow the Soviets down enough that the game is winnable, because the Germans are still fighting in July. And eventually, pretty much regardless, the Soviet offensive runs out of steam. The Soviets have spent their artillery markers, their air force has become exhausted and fallen behind the front line. Bringing it up costs a sortie, you have to leave 2 units close to the Russian border, and the German line invariably hardens. One of the differences between the Eastern Front and the Western Front is on the Eastern Front, the Germans start in quite open terrain and they fall back to quite dense closed terrain. And as they end up in small clusters around German cities, you can't cut their supply. It becomes quite hard to shift them, quite slow work. Just for information, it's worth noting, sending the fighters to the west makes very little difference in France. It causes the Western forces a whole bunch of supply headaches, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the fighting. It holds them back maybe a hex or 2. You can see here that where they didn't have to deal with the Luftwaffe, they've broken through Belgium and taken an extra city. But there isn't a lot of difference between these 2 positions. You cannot hold France against the Allied forces. Allied troops are just too strong. Let's think about this in terms of factors determining the endgame. There are basically 4 important factors in the endgame: weather, German national will, position on the 3 fronts, and the extent of the German rebuild that has taken place, which is essentially measured in terms of how many Luftwaffe sorties the Germans have managed to get back on top of the troops that they have rebuilt. You'll notice there's something that I haven't included in that list, and that's player skill. Now, it absolutely is the case that there are tactical elements to the endgame. I mean, absolutely do rebuild the Luftwaffe in an area where it's safe. Absolutely don't group the Soviet aircraft close to the front line in a way that allows them to be taken out easily. And if we're taking the endgame as a whole, the first part of the endgame, the summer offensive, has a huge range of room for tactical nuance to really come into play. But for the third part of the endgame, the bit of the endgame we're looking at today, player skill just isn't that important, not relative to the other factors. Now, obviously, amongst those other factors, there is absolutely nothing you can do about the weather. The weather is determined entirely by the dice. But there are things you can do about the other stuff. National will. National will is an important characteristic. It is the battery that fuels the Germans at the end of the game. Essentially, the life points for the German player. And as we've kind of seen from the positions I've shown, as a general rule, you can't survive with less than 20 national will. Even in the good positions we've looked at, the Allies have taken 20 points of national will. The Allies can actually take 20 points of national will in a single turn. You need to start each Allied turn at above 20 points of national will. Otherwise, just a few bad dice rolls and your game is over. On the other hand, if you've got 64 national will, i.e. if you've got so much that the Allies have to take every city in Germany and destroy a field unit in the process of taking it, I've never seen an endgame position where the Allies looked realistically like they could take every city in Germany. If you go into the endgame with Germany having 60 points or more of national will, you've probably won. And that brings us to a fairly central question. How important is collapsing the USSR? You see, there are a very limited number of ways to gain national will. Probably the most important is tactically, in the mid-game and the early part of the endgame, don't lose German units, because every German unit you lose costs your point of national will. But there's also the question of how much you gain. Let's count them out. You start with 40 points of national will. You get 8 points for defeating France. In order to defeat France, and you have to defeat France to win, in order to defeat France, you have to go through Belgium and Holland. And usually, Germany will conquer 6 to 10 minor nations. Each one of those will give 2 points of national will, so you've got 12 to 20 points from those minor allies. Those two things don't change. So the Germans will always have 60 or so points of national will. How else can you gain national will? Well, you can collapse one of the major powers. The UK, the USSR, or the USA. Collapsing any of those three gives you 16 points of national will. We can safely rule out the United States. Yes, killing 10 US units will collapse the United States. No one ever gets close to doing that. The UK can be collapsed by an invasion of the UK mainland, Operation Sea Lion. That's something that's probably worth discussing, and I've seen it happen. But let us put that aside for a moment, because I don't think it's very common. That leaves the USSR. Does the Axis player have to collapse the USSR in order to win? Do they need those 16 points of national will? Are they the difference between winning and losing? And it's worth noting, even in some of the games I showed you where Germany had really strong positions, when I started to replay those with 4 turns of fair weather, the Germans frequently had less than 16 points of national will at the end. The difference between winning and losing was whether or not they had successfully collapsed the USSR. And that matters in terms of the game. And this is, the next video will be about openings, but there are basically only 7 openings in the game. And 2 of those essentially rule out collapsing the USSR, while one of them makes it an absolute certainty. If you need the 16 points of national will, that's going to dictate the way in which you open the game. Collapsing the USSR also invokes the Moscow Treaty, and the Moscow Treaty works differently depending on exactly when it comes into effect. If it comes into effect in 1940, which is what would happen in a lot of East First games, where you immediately attack the Soviet Union and you defeat them, then all it does is give you enough time to turn and attack France. Doesn't make very much difference to the overall structure of the game. The Soviet Union is back in the game for the 1942 summer offensive, when the Soviet army and the German army are on roughly equal parity. But if the Soviet Union collapses in 1942, and of course that's what you're aiming for if you go west first and invade France and then turn to the Soviet Union, then the Soviets miss out on the 1943 summer offensive, because they don't come back into the game until the winter of 43-44. And that deprives the Soviets of a summer offensive in which they have superiority, and therefore saves the Germans any national will from lost units there. It also gives the Germans a breathing space for about 12 to 16 months in which they can dedicate their resources to fighting the British and early arrival of American forces. So it's not just that collapsing the USSR gives you 16 points of national will, collapsing the USSR potentially gives you a better position as well. So let's talk about the position. There are essentially 3 fronts in the game. We can think of them as west, east, and south. But they are not of equal value. It is much harder to make progress in the south, if we're talking in that sense about Italy, and it's much easier for the Germans to hold at the Alps in the endgame. There's also only one city really truly vulnerable, and that's Munich on the other side of the Alps. You actually have to make quite a bit of distance to go further than that. And the west and the east fronts are different in an important sense. In the west, there are more cities, and they are grouped closer to the border. In the east, there are fewer cities, and they're more spread out. The Soviets have to make more ground in order to do the same amount of national will damage. All of which reinforces the huge importance that attaches to Overlord. Let's just take a look at Allied odds on the Western Front. So this little cluster of German cities around the Rhine, which includes 4 factories. Losing this is devastating. These are the odds of a US or UK armoured unit with air support and either a surprise attack counter or some other +1 bonus attacking against a German infantry, which is either in rough terrain or behind a river. These are amazing odds. First of all, you are very, very likely to force a retreat. Secondly, you actually have a 7 in 36 chance of just causing a DD result. The Allies should be able to get 6 units into an attack. They shouldn't have any real difficulty summoning up the 18 air sorties necessary to support those 6 units, and doing so consistently turn after turn. So with those forces, if each one of those can launch 3 attacks, they're expecting to gain 11 hexes of ground and inflict 3 to 4 step losses. If the Allied forces start the endgame on the border with Germany, there is no realistic chance of the German forces holding that group of towns. They are going to fall, and likely the units defending them are going to be destroyed. You're looking at something in the order of 20 points of national will wiped out in probably 1 or 2 months. And worse, whereas on the Eastern Front you start in open terrain and fall back to closed terrain, on the Western Front you start in difficult closed terrain around the Rhine, and as you're pushed backwards you fall back into open terrain in which it's much harder to defend. Operation Overlord was the Allied landing in northern France in June 1944. If you can land in France in 1944, 3 to 4 months is enough time for the Allies to gain complete control of France, to essentially push the Germans back to the border of Germany. If you think back to the example games I showed, in almost all of the games where Germany lost, the Allies were on the western border of Germany. In almost all of the games where the Germans won, the Germans had managed to curtail the landing in some way. Either it was still at the beachheads or it had failed, but otherwise they had France. They had distance that they could surrender in order to preserve units without giving up any national will in the form of cities. The effect of stopping or containing the landings is dramatic. Overlord is far more important than almost anything else. In the Eastern Front, you're always going to stabilise in roughly the same place, in Poland or Hungary. And it doesn't really matter if you stabilise 3 hexes earlier or 3 hexes later, because the Soviets will be able to cover that ground. In the Western Front, those 3 hexes can make 10 points, 12 points of national will difference. Which brings us back to 1944 and Overlord. Can the Germans stop the Allies coming ashore? Can they curtail the landing? Now, historically, the German defence of the French coast was pretty weak. You can see that if you load up the historical scenario and compare it with this position I'm showing you here, where literally there's a line of units here along the coast. Anywhere that the Allies land on the Channel coast, they are going to be immediately opposed. Is that enough? Does it matter? This is all a topic for another video, but it's a very useful reminder. This is actually a central component. And so that's basically it. What our analysis at the Endgame tells us is it tells us the bits that really matter are Operation Overlord in 1944 and whether or not the Soviet Union collapses mid-game. Those are the 2 critical factors that fundamentally alter the endgame position. They're likely to some degree to be the deciding factors that determine the outcome. And so here endeth the lesson. This has been a longer video than I planned, and it took quite a while to prepare. I had to gather data from various games. I had to think about what that data meant, and then I kind of had to think backwards from there to what the implications of that were for the game in general. As is my want with these things, I'm saving my editorializing to the end. There is a little bit of editorializing to do here. Historically, Berlin fell in April 1945, signalling essentially the end of German resistance. The German army had in practice already lost cohesion in March. This map here shows the Soviet advance in January to March, what unconditional surrender treats as bad weather. This can't happen in unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender's simulation of the final stage of the war, the last few months of the German defence, is awful. It's really bad. It's just a lousy simulation of this part of the war. There is no way that in January, February, a Soviet player is making the 8 or 9 hex advance that they historically did in that period. Why? Well, there's a whole bunch of interconnected factors. The Germans are able to rebuild their army much more effectively than the German army actually was. The German army in April 1945, in a game of unconditional surrender, is stronger than it was at any prior point in the war. It is always a stronger army than it has been at any prior point. But the main thing, the thing that really underpins the problem, is that unconditional surrender grossly exaggerates the effect of bad weather. The result is that the Germans are able to stabilise their lines with a relatively modest investment reduction points, and that spares up economic capacity to rebuild their ground forces and Luftwaffe. And this is actually true right the way across the game. The depth of the German advance in Barbarossa in 1941 is roughly historically accurate. But the game achieves that by exaggerating the advance from July to September and underestimating the advance in October-November in bad weather. Right the way across the game, the effect that bad weather has on advances is just much greater than it historically actually was. By a small margin, the ability of units to advance in fair weather is actually somewhat exaggerated. This is most notable when a competent Soviet player attacks a weaker German player in the final summer offensive. You will often see the Soviet player achieve fair weather advances that are double or triple those the Soviets historically achieved. It's not really a gameplay issue. It is kind of just a simulation thing. The extent to which it bothers you is probably a function of the extent to which you care that the game is a simulation and not just a slightly more complicated version of Axis and Allies. But it is worth noting that unconditional surrender's treatment of weather is clearly quite a bit off base, and this is the phase in which that really is most noticeable, when it is literally impossible for the Soviet army to achieve the offensives that it historically did achieve, and the result of that is that Germany, which in fact collapsed in early 1945, will always make it to fair weather if it manages to stabilise its lines at or beyond the German border at the end of the last summer offensive. Anyway, have fun with your games, and hopefully next time I will be back with a video on opening theory in unconditional surrender.